The iron wheels of the steam locomotive shrieked against the frozen rails, a piercing cry that echoed the sudden, hollow silence inside Maylin's chest. Steam billowed in thick, choking white clouds, momentarily obscuring the grim reality of the platform. But as the wind whipped the vapor away, the truth remained as cold and hard as the Montana winter. The train was leaving. The man who had sent for her, a faceless name on a crumpled letter she no longer held, had taken one look at her travel-worn face and the poverty draped over her frame, and had turned his back. He had laughed, a cruel, barking sound, and boarded the train again, leaving her standing there as the engine chugged away, taking with it the last promise of a life she had crossed an ocean to find. She stood motionless on the wooden planks of the Silver Creek station, a solitary figure in a landscape that seemed determined to erase her. She wore no coat. She held no suitcase. Her belongings had been lost in the crossing, stolen, or discarded, leaving her with nothing but the tattered gray prairie dress that hung loosely on her thin frame. The fabric was threadbare, offering no defense against the biting wind that howled down from the granite peaks. But the most shocking sight, the detail that drew the eyes of the townsfolk peering from the warm windows of the depot, was her feet. They were bare. The skin was red, raw, and cracked, pressed flat against the frost-rimmed wood of the platform. She did not shiver, though her body screamed for warmth. She did not weep, though her soul felt crushed under the weight of the sky. She simply stood, a statue of gray sorrow against the blinding white of the snow, accepting that this was the end of her journey. The station master, a man named Higgins with a face like a dried apple and eyes devoid of charity, stepped out onto the platform, broom in hand. He did not look at Maylin as a person. He looked at her as debris, something unsightly that the train had coughed up and failed to clean away. The wind picked up, carrying with it ice crystals that stung the skin like tiny whips. Maylin lowered her head, her black hair whipping across her face, shielding her eyes from the man's scrutiny. She waited for a kindness that she knew would not come. Higgins swept the snow near her feet, the stiff bristles of the broom brushing against her frozen toes. "Train's gone, girl," he grunted, his voice rough and dismissive, barely audible over the wind. "No loitering on the platform. Move along." Move along to where? The question hung in the air, unasked but heavy. To the east lay the endless plains, buried under drifts of snow. To the west, the mountains, impassable and deadly. The town of Silver Creek lay just beyond the station, a collection of timber buildings leaking smoke from chimneys, houses filled with people who had watched her rejection with amusement rather than pity. She took a step and the pain was blinding, a sharp, tearing sensation as her skin peeled from the ice. But her face remained impassive. She was the daughter of a long line of survivors. She had endured the famine. She had endured the ship. She would endure this, even if endurance meant dying on her feet. She moved toward the side of the station building, seeking the meager shelter of the overhang, away from the direct assault of the gale. Time passed in a slow, agonizing drip of moments, each second measured by the fading sensation in her extremities. The sun began to dip lower, casting long, bruised, purple shadows across the snow. Maylin pressed her back against the rough timber of the station wall, sliding down until she sat on the frozen earth, pulling her knees to her chest in a futile attempt to conserve heat. The gray dress offered no warmth. It was a shroud of cotton, damp and useless. Inside the station she could hear the muffled sounds of life, the clinking of a stove door, the murmur of voices, the scent of brewing coffee that wafted through the cracks, mocking her emptiness. She closed her eyes, visualizing a fire, visualizing the sun, but the cold was a living thing. It gnawed at her fingers. It bit into her ears. It whispered to her that sleep would be easy, that the pain would stop if she just let go. But she would not let go. Not yet. She focused on the rhythm of her own heart, A slow, stubborn drum in the silence. Thump, thump, thump. She worked to wiggle her toes, though she could no longer feel them. She rubbed her arms with hands that looked like claws, blue-nailed and trembling. The townspeople passed by occasionally, wrapped in furs and heavy wool, glancing at the heap of gray rags in the corner. They whispered. They pointed. A group of men emerged from the saloon across the street, laughing raucously, their breath steaming in the air. One of them tossed a coin near her, not out of charity, but to see if she would move to retrieve it. She did not. The coin sank into the snow, a glittering testament to their cruelty. She was not a beggar. She was May Lynn, and if she was to freeze, she would do so with her head high, staring into the coming night. The rhythmic thud of hooves broke the monotony of the wind's howl. A large black stallion, a beast of muscle and steam, plodded into the station yard, its coat matted with ice. The rider was a mountain of a man, his silhouette broad and imposing against the failing light. He wore a heavy duster coat, the leather cracked and worn, stained with the dust of 1,000 trails and the blood of hard labor. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, revealing only a jaw set like granite, and a mouth that looked as if it had forgotten how to smile. This was Holt. He was known in the territory, not for his words, for he barely spoke, but for the quiet, dangerous competence that radiated from him. He dismounted with a heavy, fluid motion, his boots hitting the packed snow with a dull thud. His spurs did not jingle. They clinked with a muted, serious tone. He tied the horse to the rail, his large, gloved hands moving with practiced efficiency. He had come for supplies, for wire and grain, intending to ride back to his isolation before the storm fully broke. But as he turned toward the general store adjacent to the station, his eyes caught the patch of gray in the shadows. He stopped. The wind tugged at his coat, but he stood rooted, his gaze narrowing. He saw the dress, thin as paper. He saw the black hair, dusted with white frost. And then he saw the feet, bare, purple, buried in the drift. A muscle in his jaw jumped. He did not rush over. He did not cry out. He simply watched, his stillness more intense than the movement of the storm. Holt walked past her, his heavy boots crunching the snow, and entered the station house. The warmth hit him, but it brought him no comfort. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies. Higgins looked up from his ledger, a smear of ink on his finger. "Evening, Holt. Heavy weather coming." Holt didn't answer. He walked to the stove, pulling off one glove to warm a hand that was scarred and callous. The men in the corner quieted down. Holt's presence sucked the oxygen out of a room. "Saw something outside," Holt said, his voice a low rumble, like distant thunder deep in a canyon. "Girl. No shoes." Higgins chuckled nervously, wiping his hands on his apron. "Ah, the mail order reject. Yeah, sad business. Her fella didn't want her. Can't say I blame him. Looks like a stiff breeze would snap her in two. She's waiting for a miracle, I reckon." A man in the corner laughed. "She's waiting to freeze is what she is. Betting pool says she don't make it to midnight." Holt turned his head slowly, his eyes dark and unreadable. The laughter died in the man's throat. Holt looked back at the stove, watching the flames dance behind the grate. He thought of the calves he had pulled from the drifts last winter, the way he had warmed them with his own body heat. He thought of the silence of his cabin, a silence that was usually his friend, but tonight felt suddenly oppressive. He put his glove back on. He didn't buy the wire. He didn't buy the grain. He turned and walked back to the door, the heavy wood groaning as he pushed it open, stepping back into the biting cold where the girl sat, a monument to a town's heartlessness. The sun was gone now. The world had turned to shades of indigo and black. May Lynn's vision was blurring at the edges, a soft darkness encroaching on her mind. She could no longer feel her legs. The shivering had stopped, which she knew, in the vague, distant part of her mind, was the final warning before the end. She leaned her head back against the wood, looking up at the first few stars struggling to shine through the storm clouds. She wondered if the moon looked the same in China. She wondered if her mother's spirit was watching, ashamed of her daughter dying like a stray dog in a foreign land. Then the wind was blocked. A shadow fell over her, shielding her from the biting gust. She forced her heavy eyelids open. The giant was there, the man from the horse. He was kneeling in the snow, looming over her like a cliff face. Up close, his face was a map of harsh terrain, lines etched by sun and worry. But his eyes were not cruel. They were clear, dark, and startlingly focused. He didn't speak immediately. He reached out a hand, massive and leather-clad, and touched her cheek. His hand was warm. The sensation was so intense against her frozen skin that it felt like a burn. Maylin flinched, a small, pathetic movement, but she did not pull away. She was too weak. "Can't stay here," Holt said. The words were not a suggestion. They were a statement of fact, delivered with a gravity that vibrated in the air between them. He looked down at her feet again, and a flash of something unrecognizable crossed his face. Rage, perhaps, or a deep, ancestral sorrow. He stood up abruptly, the movement startling her. He began to unbutton his heavy duster. His fingers, thick and clumsy with the cold, worked the buttons until the coat hung open. He shrugged it off, the heavy leather landing in the snow for a brief second before he scooped it up. He was left in his flannel shirt and vest, the cold instantly attacking him, but he ignored it. He bent down and wrapped the enormous coat around her. It was heavy, smelling of horse sweat, tobacco, and pine, a smell of life. He tucked the edges under her legs, wrapping her like a precious parcel. "Up," he commanded. Before she could try to obey, before she could explain that her legs were no longer hers to command, he scooped her up. He lifted her as easily as if she were made of dry straw, one arm under her knees, the other supporting her back. Her head fell against his chest. She could hear his heart, a strong, steady hammer against her ear. It was the loudest thing in the world. He carried her toward the horse. The station door opened and Higgins stepped out, lantern in hand. "Now see here, Holt, you can't just—" Holt turned. He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He simply looked at the station master with a gaze so devoid of patience, so filled with a quiet, lethal promise of violence, that Higgins took a step back, the lantern trembling in his hand. "She's mine," Holt grunted. It wasn't a romantic declaration. It was a territorial claim. It was a wolf claiming a wounded pup to protect it from the pack. Anyone has a problem with that, they can come to the ranch. He turned his back on the town, on the lights, on the jeering men in the windows. He lifted Maylin onto the saddle of the black stallion, her small frame swallowed by his coat. He swung up behind her, his arms circling her, creating a cage of warmth and muscle against the storm. He pulled her tight against his chest, sharing his heat, his chin resting near the top of her head. "Hold on," he whispered into the wind, though he was holding her tight enough for both of them. He spurred the horse, and they vanished into the darkness, leaving the station and its cruelty behind, riding into the teeth of the blizzard. The journey to the ranch was a descent into a white, howling void, where time seemed to lose its meaning, measured only by the agonizing rhythm of the stallion's hooves punching through deep drifts. Maylin was no longer a woman of flesh and blood. She was a block of ice wrapped in leather, her consciousness flickering like a dying candle in a drafty room. She could feel the immense heat radiating from the man's chest against her cheek, a furnace of life that kept the darkness at bay, but her extremities were silent, absent from her mental map of her own body. Holt did not speak. He rode with the instinct of a creature born to the wild. his body adjusting to the horse's struggles, his arms locking her into a cage of safety that felt unbreakable. The wind screamed like a banshee, tearing at the brim of his hat and driving ice into his neck, but he did not flinch. He was a man accustomed to the brutality of the elements, treating the storm not as an enemy, but as a tedious obstacle to be endured. Every few minutes his gloved hand would drift up to check her breathing, a rough, frantic touch against her neck to ensure the fragile bird in his arms had not flown away. When the cabin finally emerged from the swirling white chaos, it was nothing more than a dark smudge of timber against the snow, but to Holt it was a fortress. He kicked his boots free of the stirrups and slid down, the snow reaching his knees, his movements stiff but urgent. He did not wait to tend the horse. He carried Maylin up the steps, kicked the door open with a violence that shook the frame, and carried her into the stagnant, freezing air of his home. He laid her on the bear rug before the cold hearth, her gray dress stark against the dark fur, and immediately went to work, his movements shedding their usual lethargy for a frantic, precise speed. He struck a match, the flare of sulfur illuminating his grim face, and coaxed a fire from the kindling until the flames roared, casting long, dancing shadows that fought back the gloom. The warmth of the fire began to permeate the room, but for Maylin, the return of sensation was not a relief. It was a torture session designed by demons. Holt had filled a basin with snow and brought it inside, mixing it with just enough tepid water from the kettle on the stove to take the bite out of the freeze without shocking her skin. He knelt at her feet, his large frame hunched over, looking like a penitent monk at an altar. He took her feet in his hands, hands that could brand a steer or break a fence post, and began to rub them with a gentleness that defied his appearance. He used the cool water to slowly bring the temperature up, knowing that heat applied too fast would kill the flesh. Maylin gasped, a ragged, wet sound tearing from her throat as the nerves in her toes woke up screaming. It felt as though her feet were being crushed by stones and set on fire simultaneously. She tried to pull away, her body thrashing weakly on the rug, tears streaming down her soot-stained face. "I know," Holt rumbled, his voice rough with a helpless sort of empathy. "I know. It burns. You gotta let it burn." He did not let go. He held her ankles firmly, anchoring her through the pain, his thumbs working the circulation back into the pale, waxy skin. He watched her face, his own features tight with reflected agony. He had seen grown men weep for less, had seen cowboys lose toes to the frost for lack of care. But she endured. She bit her lip until it bled, her whimpers turning into low, guttural moans of suffering. Holt kept working, dipping his hands, rubbing, watching the color slowly, agonizingly shift from deadly white to a bruised, angry red. He saw the scars on her ankles from previous hardships, the calluses of a life of labor, and he felt a surge of protective rage so potent it nearly made him dizzy. She was a warrior in a broken body, and he swore in that flickering light that he would be her shield. Days bled into weeks, the storm outside breaking only to be replaced by a silence so profound it felt heavy. Maylin did not die. She did not lose her feet, though the skin peeled and the pain lingered, forcing her to hobble with a cane Holt had carved from a sturdy branch. For the first week she lay on his bed, buried under quilts, while he slept on the floor near the fire, a silent sentinel. As her strength returned, so did her pride. She looked around the cabin and saw a reflection of the man, sturdy, functional, but neglected. Dust coated the shelves. The windows were grime-streaked. The floor was a map of muddy boot prints. She began to work. It started small, mending a tear in his flannel shirt while he was out checking the herd. When he returned, he stared at the neat, tiny stitches, his thumb tracing the line of thread, but he said nothing. Then she scrubbed the floors. She scoured the cast-iron pans. She found a sack of flour and dried apples and made a pie that smelled of cinnamon and home. Holt would come in from the biting cold, stomping snow from his boots, and freeze in the doorway. The scent of soap and hot food hit him like a physical blow, confusing his solitary heart. He would watch her limping around his kitchen, her gray dress washed and mended, her black hair braided neatly down her back. She was no longer the ghost from the station. She was a force of nature. He tried to tell her to sit, to rest, pointing at her feet with a gruff grunt. She would simply shake her head, her eyes defiant, and hand him a plate of stew. "I work," she said, her voice quiet but firm, the first words she had spoken to him in days. "I pay for life." Holt looked at her, really looked at her, and realized he wasn't keeping a servant. He was living with an equal. The silence between them shifted. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the companionable quiet of two people moving in orbit around each other, binding themselves together with every swept floor and every shared meal. The supplies eventually ran low, forcing a confrontation with the world they had left behind. Holt harnessed the team to the buckboard wagon, his face set in a grim line. He helped May Lynn up to the seat, his hands lingering at her waist for a fraction of a second too long, ensuring she was steady. She wore a coat he had bought from a trapper passing through, too big but warm, and boots he had ordered by mail stuffed with wool to fit her small feet. The ride to Silver Creek was tense. When they rolled into town, the atmosphere changed. Heads turned. Whispers hissed like snakes from the boardwalks. The mail-order reject had survived, and worse, she was sitting high on the wagon of the most feared recluse in the valley. They stopped at the general store. As Holt loaded sacks of flour into the back, a group of men gathered. Among them was the man who had rejected her at the train station, a dandy named Vance, with a weak chin and cruel eyes. "Well, look at that," Vance sneered, stepping forward, emboldened by his friends. "The trash didn't freeze. You picking through my garbage, Holt? Didn't know you were desperate enough to take a woman I wouldn't even let scrub my floors." The air crackled. May Lynn froze, her hands gripping her skirt, shame burning her cheeks. She expected Holt to ignore him, to finish his work and leave. Instead, Holt dropped the sack of grain. It hit the ground with a heavy thud. He turned slowly, his duster sweeping back to reveal the Colt on his hip, though his hand never moved toward it. He didn't need a gun. He walked up to Vance, towering over him, radiating a darkness that made the sunlight seem dim. The street fell silent. "You threw away a diamond 'cause you wanted a rock," Holt said, his voice low, carrying to every ear on the street. "She ain't garbage. She's the only thing in this town worth a damn. You speak to her again, you look at her again, and I won't be talking." He turned his back on the men, the ultimate insult, and walked to the wagon. He climbed up, took the reins, and looked at May Lynn. For the first time in public, he touched the brim of his hat to her, a gesture of supreme respect. "Ready, ma'am?" he asked. She nodded, tears of vindication stinging her eyes. They rode out, heads high, leaving the town small and insignificant in their dust. That evening the cabin felt different. The vindication of the afternoon had stripped away the last barriers of hesitation between them. The fire popped and hissed, casting a golden glow over the room. May Lynn sat in the rocking chair mending a sock, while Holt cleaned his tack, the smell of saddle soap mixing with the scent of pine. He was restless, his hands fumbling with buckles he could usually fasten in his sleep. Finally he put the leather down and stood up. He crossed the room, his heavy boots silent on the floorboards she had scrubbed so clean. He stopped in front of her and she looked up, her needle pausing in mid-air. He looked terrified, more terrified than he had been in the blizzard, more terrified than facing the mob. He went down on one knee, a slow, deliberate lowering of his massive frame that brought him to her eye level. He took her hands, his rough, scarred fingers engulfing her delicate ones. He didn't have a poetic speech prepared. He didn't have a diamond ring. He pulled a simple band of polished silver from his vest pocket, something he had hammered out himself from a coin in the late hours of the night. His throat worked as he swallowed. He looked at her, searching her face for the rejection he had expected all his life, but finding only warmth. "I ain't much," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly, stripping away the stoic mask to reveal the lonely man underneath. "I got this land. I got these hands. But the house, it was cold before you. I was cold." He took a breath, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "Maylin, you saved me, not the other way around." He paused, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that stopped her heart. "Can you be my wife forever?" Maylin looked at the man who had carried her through the snow, who had washed her frozen feet, who had stood before the wolves of the world and claimed her as treasure. She dropped the needle. She reached out and cupped his rough, weather-beaten face, feeling the scruff of his jaw, the heat of his skin. "Forever," she whispered back, the word a vow, a promise, and a prayer all at once. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. The wind howled outside, battering the walls of the cabin, but inside there was no fear. There was only the fire, the silence of understanding, and two outcasts who had found their kingdom in each other. They had been discarded by the world, deemed unworthy and broken, yet in the wilderness they had built a love stronger than iron and warmer than the sun. Maylin and Holt remind us that our worth is not determined by those who reject us, but by those who hold us when we are broken. True love isn't about perfection. It's about being the shelter in someone else's storm. If you believe that everyone deserves a second chance at happiness, and if this story warmed your heart, please like this video and subscribe for more stories of resilience, love, and the triumph of the human spirit. You are never truly alone.